Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1893. The heat was already lifting when the morning stage swung in from Benson, its wheels carving shallow crescents in the dust along Allen Street. The silver boom had long since faded, and with it the clang of the stamp mills. What remained was a town learning to breathe at a quieter pace. Shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the printer at the Epitaph tapping out headlines about the Panic of '93, and ranch wagons shouldering past with alfalfa and fence posts. Late summer clouds, those stubborn monsoon holdovers, stacked above the Dragoon Mountains, hinting at rain that rarely reached the ground. It was a season of waiting, of leaner shelves and careful words. Into this ordinary morning came a small, unremarkable envelope. It arrived at the Cochise County Health Office, addressed in a tidy, looping hand to Dr. Samuel Keats, the town's overworked physician and reluctant registrar of births and deaths. No return address. Inside, 3 folded pages. The first was a single paragraph, and signed, almost painfully polite, "Doctor, I do not wish harm, only help," followed by a sentence that landed like the heavy door of a safe. "There are things happening out east of town that no child should be born into." The other 2 pages were stranger still. A shaky family chart where the same surnames looped back upon themselves, cousins marked as spouses, arrows doubled and redoubled across 7 neat rows. Someone had spent time on this. Someone wanted it understood. By noon, the whisper had made its rounds, as whispers do in a place where news outruns proof. A shopkeeper repeated that Mrs. Voss, the midwife who serviced most of the ranches along the Charleston Road, had been summoned in the night and returned at dawn, chalk-white and quiet. She said little, only that she wouldn't be going back, not without another set of eyes and proper records. Another merchant swore a school census taker had noticed 3 siblings of similar age who answered to 2 different last names. Though they lived under one roof, none of it was evidence. All of it was troubling. Dr. Keats carried the envelope to the back room where the ledgers were kept, brown cloth books with births, deaths, and marriages stamped in fading gilt. He ran a finger down years of neat entries. In a town that still measured itself by brandings, water rights, and the vagaries of the silver price, such books were the closest thing to a shared memory. If a pattern existed, it would be here, pressed between ink and paper. On the desk, a small wedge of desert light cut through the shutters and lay across the chart like a quiet verdict. No one said the word incest out loud. Not yet. Tombstone had known its share of hard stories. Minors buried too soon, fevers that took infants in winter, gunmen who mistook pride for justice. But this was a different kind of unease, the kind that grew in silence, that asked whether suffering might be woven into the fabric of a family and then excused as custom. A letter, a chart, a midwife's refusal. It might have been nothing. It felt like the start of something that would demand more courage than anger. By dusk, the wind picked up and pushed sand down the empty street. Dr. Keats locked the ledgers, pocketed the envelope, and set his hat low against the grit. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go east of town and knock on a door. Whatever the truth was, it would not be met with rumors. It would be met with a record, a clear eye, and questions that did not flinch. The following morning broke with the copper tint of an Arizona sunrise, the kind that promised heat long before noon. Dr. Samuel Keats rode east out of Tombstone on a bay mare borrowed from the livery, his satchel bumping against the saddle horn. He carried little more than a few medical instruments, a worn notebook, and the envelope folded carefully in his coat pocket. The Charleston Road stretched before him in pale ribbons of dust, lined with brittle mesquite and the husks of grass left from last year's rains. It was a road that led toward isolation, where families could vanish into the expanse of ranchland and scrub and answer to no one but themselves. After nearly 2 hours, the doctor reached a fork marked only by a leaning post of weathered cedar. A pair of wagon ruts veered north toward low hills, their grooves deepened by decades of use. He guided the mare into the tracks, feeling the stillness deepen. Out here, sounds carried differently. The call of a crow echoed across the draws, the creak of saddle leather seemed louder, and even his horse's breathing felt like an intrusion. The homestead appeared at last, a squat structure of adobe and timber that looked older than its current inhabitants. The plaster had sloughed away in strips, revealing the bones of rough stone beneath. A single cottonwood clung to the edge of a dry creek bed nearby, its leaves clattering weakly in the wind. Fencing sagged at odd angles, patched with wire and whatever lumber had been on hand. There was no evidence of prosperity, no stacked hay bales, no well-kept corrals. Instead, the place gave off an air of endurance, as though its purpose had been survival and nothing more. A woman emerged from the doorway as Keats approached. She was tall, her frame wiry from labor, her dress sun-bleached to a colorless gray. Her eyes, set deep under a broad brow, held both suspicion and fatigue. She did not greet him with words, only wiped her hands on her apron and waited. Behind her, shadows shifted, children, perhaps, or others curious about the rare visitor. "I am Dr. Keats," he began, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy. "I received word that there may be health concerns here. I thought it best to see for myself." The woman studied him a long moment before stepping aside. "If it's health you're after," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "then you'd better come in. We've had more than our share of trouble." Inside, the single main room bore the marks of hard living. A wood stove stood crooked in one corner, its pipe patched with tin. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, perhaps old blood or rust. A table with mismatched chairs occupied the center, cluttered with jars of preserves, sewing scraps, and a Bible whose spine had long ago cracked. 3 children sat along the far wall. At first glance they seemed ordinary enough. Barefoot, hair uncombed, faces pale from too much time indoors. But as Keats let his eyes adjust, details pressed forward. A boy whose gaze refused to meet his, staring instead at the floor with an unsettling stillness. A girl with shoulders hunched unnaturally high, as if compensating for something beneath the skin. Another child who seemed both older and younger than his years, his expression too knowing for such a small frame. The woman gestured toward them without explanation. "They're strong enough most days. Other days," she let the sentence trail off, and in that silence the house seemed to pulse with unspoken history. Keats nodded politely, though his pulse quickened. He had come looking for truth, and already the air felt heavy with it. This was no simple case of hardship. This was a household carrying something it could not name. A story written on the faces of its children and in the weary defiance of their mother. And he knew, even before he unlatched his satchel, that whatever he found here would not be easily forgotten. Backhand index pointing right. "Would you like me to go on with block 3? First observations now, keeping the same slow, investigative tone? Voce dis. Continue M. Ingalls. O chat GPT dis. Block 3, first observations." Dr. Keats set his satchel down on the table and drew out his notebook, though he did not open it immediately. He preferred to watch first, to let the quiet of a room tell its own story before committing anything to paper. The 3 children had not moved from their places against the wall. Their mother, still standing by the door as though guarding it, offered no words of encouragement, no attempt to soften their stiffness. The boy nearest the window shifted slightly, and the weak light caught his profile. His jaw was too small for the rest of his face, and when he swallowed, the muscles along his neck pulled unevenly, as though tugging against a crooked bone. The girl at his side had a strange gait even while sitting. Her knees bent inward, her ankles twisted outward, so that when she shifted, her body formed awkward angles. The youngest child, perhaps no more than 5 or 6, kept his hands clasped tight together, pressing them to his chest as though shielding himself. His forehead was broad, the eyes set too close, but what unsettled Keats more was the expression. An odd mixture of vacancy and guardedness, as if the child already knew the danger of being studied. The physician cleared his throat gently. "Have there been fevers? Any difficulty with breathing, eating, sleeping?" The woman's eyes flicked to the children before returning to him. "They manage," she said curtly. "We do what we can." "Schooling?" Keats asked. "They've had some," she replied. "Not much call for letters when there's work to be done." Her tone was clipped, but beneath it he caught a trace of something else. Shame, perhaps, or weariness at having to offer the same justifications to outsiders who never stayed long enough to understand. As Keats observed, he noted smaller details that carried heavier meaning. There were no family portraits on the walls, only a few hand-sewn quilts that looked older than the house itself. The shelves held jars of preserves but no children's toys, no traces of books save for the battered Bible. The silence between the children was too complete, as if conversation had never been practiced among them. The doctor pressed further. Do they have uncles, cousins, grandparents who visit? The question hung in the air like a spark. The woman's hands tightened against her apron. We look after our own, she said finally, her voice firmer, almost defiant. Keats nodded slowly, but his mind turned. The words were telling, our own, a phrase that in his line of work often masked what polite company preferred not to name. He recalled the family chart from the letter, the tangled loops of kinship that had seemed impossible to sustain. Looking at the children, he felt the weight of that possibility pressing closer. From outside came the sudden bray of a mule, startling in the stillness. The children flinched in unison, as though accustomed to sudden noises marking danger. Keats leaned back in his chair, realizing that whatever had been whispered in town was no mere invention. Here, before him, stood living evidence, not yet explained, but unmistakably present, that something inside this family line had gone badly wrong. As he rose to fetch his satchel, he caught his own reflection in a cloudy bit of mirror propped against the wall. For a moment he wondered not only what he would write, but whether Tombstone itself was ready to read it. The following day, after leaving the homestead, Dr. Keats spent hours in the back room of the county office, thumbing through old ledgers that smelled of ink, dust, and neglect. Tombstone was young compared to the old towns of the East, but its records already told stories in their own blunt way. Names repeated, marriages logged by itinerant justices, births scrawled in uncertain penmanship. It did not take long before a pattern began to emerge. The family in question, he would not yet write their name in his notebook, had roots reaching back to the first settlers who staked claims along the San Pedro River. They had come in the late 1850s, wagon creaking westward from Texas, seeking land where cattle might graze and government eyes did not pry. By the time Tombstone was founded in 1879, their household was already established, tucked into the folds of hills where neighbors were scarce and visits rarer still. At first, nothing about them drew notice. They supplied beef to mining camps, traded hides and wool, and occasionally appeared in town for supplies. But the ledgers revealed something unusual. Marriages that never crossed beyond 2 surnames. Year after year, cousin wed cousin. Brothers' children to sisters' children, uncles' sons to nieces. Each generation seemed to fold back into itself, as though no other families existed. In a place where long distances often forced kin to marry kin, such unions were not unheard of, but never with such relentless regularity. Neighbors had their own recollections. At the Grand Hotel bar, a rancher remembered seeing the men from that family at cattle auctions, their speech oddly slurred, their temper quick to flare. A teacher from Charleston recalled 2 sisters who attended her school briefly in the 1870s, quiet girls with heavy brows and a strange way of walking, until their father pulled them out, insisting that home was the only classroom they needed. Even the midwife, Mrs. Voss, had been muttering for years about babies that came out wrong, though most dismissed her words as the exaggerations of an aging woman. The town itself bore no official record of complaint. The church had married them, the clerks had stamped their papers, and life had gone on. In an era where survival meant minding one's own affairs, it was easier to let silence cover unease. Isolation allowed such things to continue. Out on the ranches, kinship blurred into necessity, and necessity excused what might otherwise have been condemned. Yet by 1893, the cost was becoming harder to ignore. Dr. Keats saw it in the entries marked stillborn or infant death, written in grim repetition beside the family's name. He saw it in the notations of children who lived only days or weeks. And he heard it in the careful way townsfolk lowered their voices when the surname arose, as if speaking too loudly might bring shame, or worse, invite attention they were not prepared to confront. For Tombstone, a town once infamous for gunfights and silver fortunes, this was a different kind of scandal. It was not lawless men with revolvers, but something quieter, buried within the walls of a house. Choices repeated until they became tradition, and tradition hardened into a curse carried by the children themselves. The town had tolerated it for decades. Now, through a single anonymous letter and the persistence of one doctor, the silence was beginning to crack. Dr. Keats sat at his desk late into the night, a lantern burning low as moths battered themselves against the glass. Before him lay the anonymous family chart from the letter, the county ledgers he had copied into his notebook, and the images still fresh in his mind from the visit to the homestead. Each piece on its own was troubling, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The faces of the children lingered most vividly. The girl's uneven posture, the boy's narrow jaw, the youngest child's broad forehead, all bore echoes of the same traits. When placed beside the records of repeated cousin marriages, the suspicion grew sharper. These were not isolated deformities, but markers of bloodlines folded back on themselves too many times. His medical training told him what polite society would not. Prolonged consanguinity could magnify weaknesses, multiplying the risks of illness, deformity, and fragile minds. What he had seen in that house was the living proof. But the doctor was cautious. Tombstone was no stranger to rumor, and he knew the danger of turning whispers into accusations. He sought confirmation. Over the following week, he spoke quietly with townsfolk who had brushed against the family over the years. A blacksmith recalled shoeing their horses, animals unusually small and weak compared to neighboring stock. A store clerk remembered the family's children rarely spoke when brought to town, clinging instead to one another, eyes lowered as if rehearsed. Even the parish priest, when pressed, admitted unease. He had baptized infants whose limbs were not as the Lord intended, though he had said nothing at the time. Each story was small, almost dismissible, but together they carried the same undertone, a recognition that something was wrong, and a willingness to look away. The family's isolation had shielded them, their land distant enough to keep questions at bay, their ties strong enough to discourage outsiders. They keep to themselves, people said. Always have. The phrase repeated so often it became less explanation than excuse. Keats began to notice inconsistencies in their accounts as well. The mother he had met claimed her children had received some schooling, yet no teacher recalled their names in the rolls. The father, absent during his first visit, was said by neighbors to be ailing, though no one could say with what, and the chart in the envelope, its lines looping generation after generation, fit too neatly with the deformities he had witnessed. Whoever had drawn it wanted him to see the truth, though they lacked the courage to sign their name. By now, suspicion had hardened into conviction. The family's condition could not be explained by hardship alone. The deformities, the deaths, the secrecy, these were the wages of a closed circle, kin marrying kin until the very structure of the body began to betray them. What unsettled Keats most was not the discovery itself, but the realization that Tombstone had tolerated it for decades. Everyone had known a part of the truth, yet no one had spoken the whole of it aloud. And so he resolved to return to the homestead once more, this time not only with his satchel but with pointed questions. The truth was no longer hidden in records or rumors. It lived in plain sight, on the faces of children who bore the legacy of 7 generations. The only question that remained was whether the family would let him name it. When Dr. Keats returned to the homestead a week later, the reception was colder. The same woman stood in the doorway, but this time her stance was less guarded hospitality and more outright defiance. She crossed her arms as he dismounted, her lips pressed tight against words she seemed unwilling to say. "You've been asking around," she accused before he could speak. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "We hear things in town same as anyone else. Folks talk, and it always comes back to us." Keats removed his hat, dust clinging to its brim. "I have a duty," he said evenly. "There are records, testimonies, and—" He hesitated, recalling the children's faces. "Evidence that suggests the health of your family may be at risk." My only concern is their welfare. The door creaked wider and a man appeared, broad-shouldered, unshaven, his skin worn by years of desert sun. His expression was not hostile, but it carried the weight of someone who had grown accustomed to guarding secrets. "We don't need your concern," he said flatly. "Our people have lived out here near 40 years without your help. We'll go on the same way." Inside, the children were nowhere to be seen. The air smelled faintly of kerosene and smoke, as if they had burned something recently. Papers, perhaps, or garments. On the mantel, the battered Bible remained, but the loose scraps and old documents Keats had noticed before were gone. It was as though the family had swept away anything that might serve as proof. "I'd like to conduct an examination," Keats pressed, softening his tone. "Nothing invasive, just to ensure the children are strong." The father's jaw tightened. "They don't need to be paraded like animals for you to measure and prod. We know how to look after our own." The word stung. The phrase again, our own, used not as pride now, but as a shield. Keats glanced at the mother. Her hands were trembling slightly, betraying a fear she did not voice. Yet she did not intervene. For the better part of an hour, the doctor attempted questions. About family history, about births and deaths, about illnesses that seemed to repeat. Each inquiry was met with half-answers, abrupt silences, or outright denial. At last, the father cut him off. "You'll not write about us," he said, voice low but commanding. "We know how stories twist in town. A family minding its land becomes a carnival tale in the saloon. We won't have it." It was not just defensiveness, it was fear, deep and desperate. Fear of exposure, of shame, of having their way of life dragged beneath the judgment of townsfolk who had long turned a blind eye. The house seemed to close around them, its walls heavy with secrets that would not willingly come out. When Keats finally left, the sun was dropping behind the Dragoon Mountains, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert floor. He felt no closer to answers than when he arrived, yet the resistance itself spoke volumes. Families with nothing to hide did not bar their children from a physician's care. Families with nothing to fear did not burn their papers in haste. He realized then that uncovering the truth would not come through polite questioning. It would demand testimony from those outside the household, people who had seen enough to piece together what the family refused to confess. The battle ahead would not be only against secrecy, but against a town too comfortable with silence. The turning point came not from the family itself, but from those who had brushed close enough to feel the weight of their secrets. After his second visit ended in silence and defiance, Dr. Keats began collecting stories with greater care, approaching those who had nothing to gain by speaking and everything to lose by remaining quiet. The first was Mrs. Voss, the midwife. She lived in a small adobe dwelling near the San Pedro, her hands permanently scented with herbs and lye. At first, she resisted, her eyes narrowing, her lips trembling as though she feared reprisal. But when Keats placed the folded family chart before her, she exhaled sharply and confessed. "I've delivered near 20 of their children," she whispered, as though the walls themselves might carry word back. "More than half never drew breath, or left this world before the week was out. Some were born twisted, with limbs bent wrong, others with eyes clouded or lungs too weak to cry. I told them it wasn't God's curse but their own doing, marrying blood to blood. But they shut me out when I spoke it plain." She drew open a trunk and handed him a tattered notebook, her own record, crude but honest. Dates, names, and notes of each birth. The pages mirrored what Keats had seen in the county ledgers, but here the margins carried her sorrowful observations. Stillborn, weak heart, spine crooked beyond help. The second testimony came from Reverend Whitfield, a man who had baptized many of those same children. When pressed, he admitted he had long suspected something unnatural in the lineage. "I told myself it was hardship, poor soil, harsh winters," he murmured, fingers worrying the edge of his collar. But the truth was clear enough in their faces. I failed them by turning scripture into excuse instead of seeking truth. A third piece arrived in the form of documents. At the courthouse, Keats unearthed a stack of old marriage licenses. Names looping back upon themselves, Cousins joined in nearly every generation. One license even recorded an uncle marrying his niece, signed by a justice of the peace who had since died. The paper was brittle, but the ink left no room for doubt. Then came a neighbor's story. Thomas Avery, a rancher whose property bordered the family's land, admitted under hushed tones that he'd once taken in a runaway girl. Barely 16, trembling, clothes torn. She had been one of the daughters. "She stayed with us 3 days before her kin came for her," he said grimly. "She begged not to go back, said she'd been promised to her cousin. My wife wept when they dragged her off. I thought about raising a fuss, but folks told me plain, best leave them be. So I did." His voice broke at the memory. "God forgive me." Each account aligned too neatly with the others. The midwife's ledger, the preacher's hesitations, the official records, the neighbor's guilt. They formed a picture the family could no longer erase. The truth was written not only in deformities and deaths but in the silence of a town that had chosen not to interfere. By the end of that week, Keats spread the testimonies and documents across his desk. The pattern was undeniable. 7 generations of marriages bound by blood, each one narrowing the circle, each one paying a heavier price. What had begun as a whisper in an anonymous letter had become a chorus of reluctant witnesses, every voice pointing toward the same revelation. The doctor knew the time had come. The truth was ready to be spoken, even if the town was not ready to hear it. The moment of truth arrived in the most public place Tombstone had, the Cochise County Courthouse. By late September of 1893, whispers had grown too loud to contain, and the sheriff himself, urged on by townsfolk who were tired of secrets curdling into scandal, called for an inquiry. The hearing was not a trial, not yet, but the wooden benches filled quickly all the same. Merchants, miners, ranch hands, and their wives pressed shoulder to shoulder, curiosity wrestling with dread. At the front, under the gaze of the territorial seal, sat Sheriff Bauer, Reverend Whitfield, and 2 county clerks with ledgers stacked before them. Dr. Keats stood nearby, his notes folded tight in his hands, the weight of weeks of testimony heavy on his shoulders. The family did not appear in person, though 2 of their older sons lurked at the back, arms crossed, eyes hard. Keats began by reading the anonymous letter aloud, his voice steady but measured. The words, "There are things happening east of town that no child should be born into," hung in the still air, sharper now than they had been on paper. Then, one by one, he laid out the evidence. The midwife's private ledger with its columns of stillbirths and malformed infants, the courthouse records of marriages that never crossed beyond 2 surnames, the neighbor's account of a runaway girl dragged back to her cousin's bed. Each piece struck the room like a hammer. When Mrs. Voss herself rose to confirm her testimony, the crowd shifted uneasily. "I have seen it with my own hands," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "Babies born with lungs too weak, with bodies too twisted. This is no curse from heaven. It is the cost of marrying kin to kin until the blood runs thin." Her words silenced even the hard-eyed sons at the back. The Reverend followed, shame etched into his features. He admitted to baptizing infants whose bodies bore marks of deformity, and to offering comfort without ever questioning the cause. His confession sent murmurs rippling through the pews. For the first time, the town heard aloud what had been whispered for decades. Finally, Keats opened his notebook and read aloud the summary he had labored over. 7 generations of cousin marriages have produced a family line marked by deformity, illness, and secrecy. These children are not the result of misfortune but of choices repeated until they became tradition. What I have seen, and what others have confirmed, leaves no room for doubt. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. People shifted, eyes darting to neighbors, to the floor, anywhere but the evidence spread before them. For years they had excused it, ignored it, or laughed it off. Now the truth lay bare, undeniable and damning. The sheriff cleared his throat, his face stern. "What's been revealed here today cannot be buried again. The law will do what it can, though the law is thin in matters of the heart and household. But make no mistake, This town will not look away any longer. A storm seemed to move through the room. Anger, pity, revulsion, and sorrow mingling in equal measure. The secret of the family, long hidden in the hills east of town, had been dragged into the light. And in that moment, Tombstone itself seemed to flinch, confronted not with gunfighters or outlaws, but with the unsettling truth of what silence had allowed to grow in its shadow. The inquiry did not end with a gavel strike or a single declaration. Instead, it spilled into the days and weeks that followed, as Tombstone grappled with what it had allowed to fester in its own backyard. The revelations had cracked open a silence that could not be resealed, and now every faction of the town wrestled with what to do. The sheriff's office moved first. Sheriff Bauer dispatched deputies to the family's ranch, not with warrants for arrest. Territorial law had little precedent for prosecuting incest unless clear coercion could be proven, but with orders to document living conditions and report on the children's welfare. What they found confirmed much of Keats's testimony. Sparse provisions, shuttered windows, children kept indoors for days on end. Yet without specific statutes to charge against, Bauer's hands were tied. The church, led by Reverend Whitfield, called a meeting of its congregation. From the pulpit he admitted his own failure, confessing that years of baptisms and blessings had been offered without confronting the deeper sin at their root. The sermon was not fire and brimstone but weary contrition, and it left parishioners divided. Some demanded excommunication, while others, out of pity or kinship ties, urged compassion. The phrase, "Judge not lest ye be judged," passed between pews with increasing fervor, though few could ignore the gnawing truth that children had borne the brunt of their parents' choices. Neighbors, emboldened now that the secret was public, came forward with more accounts. One rancher admitted he had long refused to trade cattle with the family, fearing their animals were weak from the same thin blood. Another recalled hearing cries in the night from the homestead, sounds he now wished he had investigated. A schoolteacher confessed that she had once sent a report to the county about the children's absences, only to see it vanish without reply. The town's collective guilt deepened with every story. For the family themselves, consequences arrived in subtler but equally crushing forms. They became pariahs in town. Merchants refused credit. Children pointed and whispered when they caught sight of the younger ones on the rare trips into town. The father, once respected as a capable rancher, now rode into Tombstone under stares sharp enough to cut leather. His wife no longer entered the general store. Instead, she sent the older boys, who endured the murmurs of Inbred with clenched fists and lowered eyes. The territorial court in Tucson eventually weighed in, spurred by the publicity the case had drawn. A visiting judge reviewed Keats's documentation and the midwife's records, then issued a formal censure, not a conviction, but a public declaration that the family's practices were contrary to public morals and hazardous to the health of offspring. It was a hollow sentence in legal terms, but a devastating one in social weight. The declaration was published in the Tombstone epitaph, forever fixing their name to scandal. For Dr. Keats, the outcome was bittersweet. He had sought to protect the children, but the law offered little beyond exposure and shame. The family's daily lives did not change overnight. The children still lived under the same roof. The parents still clung to their insular ways. Yet a barrier had been broken. Their secrecy was gone. The town's tolerance had shifted into condemnation. And in that fragile space between silence and justice, Tombstone faced its own reckoning. It was not enough to brandish outrage after years of willful blindness. The story of the family was now also the story of a community that had failed to intervene until it was far too late. By the spring of 1894, Tombstone had returned to its slower rhythms. The mines remained quiet, businesses scraped by, and the desert winds carried on as they always had. Yet beneath the ordinary pulse of life, the memory of the inquiry lingered, etched into the town's conscience like a scar. The family at the center of the scandal withdrew further into themselves. They rarely came into town except when necessity demanded it, and when they did, their presence was met with cold stares or pitying silence. The children, once hidden, grew into awkward adolescence under the burden of eyes that no longer pretended not to see. A few of the older boys drifted away to distant ranches or mining camps, seeking anonymity in places where their name carried less weight. Others stayed, bound by land and obligation, caught in the cycle their parents had fought to preserve. For the youngest children, there was a sliver of intervention. The county arranged for two to attend school in town, the first in their family to sit in a classroom alongside strangers. Their progress was halting, hampered by years of neglect and physical frailties, but their presence marked a quiet break from the isolation that had defined their bloodline. Whether it was enough to alter the family's course remained uncertain. In the years that followed, the case became less of a daily scandal and more of a cautionary tale. Ranchers and townsfolk invoked it in hushed tones when speaking of secrecy, pride, or the dangers of turning inward too long. Parents warned their children against closing ranks too tightly. Preachers used it as a parable about the wages of silence, urging their congregations to intervene when wrongs festered in their midst. Dr. Keats remained in Tombstone for several more years, his role shifting from physician to reluctant chronicler of the community's conscience. In his journals, he wrote not only about the medical consequences of consanguinity but about the deeper wound of complicity. How neighbors, officials, and clergy had each noticed signs yet allowed tradition and distance to excuse them. It was not sin alone that harmed those children, he noted, but the long quiet of a town that chose not to speak. By the end of the decade, the family's name had faded from newspaper pages, though it never truly left local memory. The ranch still stood east of town, weathering storms and droughts, its walls holding the stories of 7 generations bound too closely together. The wider world moved on, Tombstone itself shrinking into a quieter frontier town, but the lesson endured. The case of 1893 was not about lawless gunmen or mining fortunes lost, but about something more intimate and unsettling: the fragility of family when cut off from the wider world, and the danger of secrets allowed to grow unchecked. In the silence of the desert evenings, when the sun fell behind the dragoons and the air cooled just enough to breathe easy, those who remembered could not help but reflect. Some felt anger, others sorrow, but most carried the same quiet conviction: that no community, however small or isolated, could afford to look away again.